Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to Cram. Thanks for joining me as we explore new and innovative research and big ideas that may change the way you think and act. You know, it's funny how we come up with topics for this show. Many of them just come out of daily conversations. Sometimes you hit a subject that resonates with people, and I think that is true for today's topic, perfectionism. It came up when I was chatting with a young colleague of mine recently, and she said we needed to do a podcast on this because she felt perfectionism not only ruled her life, but it was pervasive among her friends. Is that true? And if so, what's going on? And somehow I have the feeling young people in their 20s aren't the only ones dealing with perfectionism. Simon Sherry is a practicing psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University. He's an internationally recognized expert on perfectionism, and he joins us. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Mary. Thank you for having me on Cram.
Oh, well, thanks for being a part of this. I thought maybe we should start off and just talk about what is perfectionism.
That's a great question, and one we've been able to shed a lot of light on over the past 30 years in science. This is an unrelenting drive toward perfection. Perfectionists often want to be perfect in nearly everything they want to do. They'll work on something until it's perfect and often won't give up. So it's holding high standards, ceaselessly pursuing perfection, and often being quite self-critical when something less than perfect is achieved. Now, there are important aspects, or we'd say dimensions of perfectionism beyond just that self-related requirement that you be perfect. For instance, perfectionists can be enormously hard on other people. Oftentimes, if you need to be perfect, you also need your spouse or your coworker or your friend to be perfect. And in the research literature, that's often called other-oriented perfectionism. You direct your need for perfection outward at other people. Narcissists are prone to that form of perfection too. They need others around them to be perfect. They have grandiose expectations for those around them. And there are other, even more pernicious forms of perfectionism. Oftentimes, perfectionists report an intense pressure from other people to be perfect. They think their boss, their coworker, their spouse needs them to be perfect, or sometimes it's just a vague and undifferentiated sense that other people need me to be perfect, or society needs me to be perfect, but a real, tangible, strong, and unpleasant pressure that's felt by the individual to be perfect. Perfectionists often are self-doubting. They'll do one thing, go back, check it again, recheck it. They can have a lot of self-doubt in their actions, wanting to verify that something's perfect. And then another really salient trait you'll see among perfectionists is an extreme or an exaggerated concern over mistakes. Mistakes are not permitted when you're trying to go for perfect. And when a normal range mistake occurs, oftentimes it's catastrophized by the perfectionist and seen as a great source of shame and an unforgivable error. Those are some of your key aspects to the personality of a perfectionist.
Oh boy. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. And the sense I get from your description is that there are factors that are coming from the inside of a person, but also externally. There are factors that are impinging on that person as well. So it can work both ways, right?
Absolutely. Perfectionism can go inward, it can go outward, and it can be experienced as a real pressure from other people, cultural factors, or society at large.
Yeah. So, I want to address what I spoke about in the introduction. And I think you're the right researcher to ask about this relationship between perfectionism and young people, because you conducted a large study that involved thousands of participants. What did you find from that work?
So there's two studies that really speak to this. One from my camp at Dalhousie and joined by my colleagues, Martin Smith and a few other researchers from our team at Dal. And then another really great study, influential study by two psychologists across the pond in Britain, Andy Hill being one of them. And these studies both converged on the same idea, which is there is significant, meaningful, observable growth in perfectionism in our society. Perfectionism levels are on the rise over the past 2 to 3 decades. It would seem that our young adults, we'll call them 18 to 25-year-olds, seem to be particularly experiencing a rise in perfectionism. And we're not entirely sure why that is. Some obvious speculations would include increased exposure to social media, which creates a lot of social comparisons and drives a individualistic, hyper-competitive, keeping up with the Joneses type of mentality, which is conducive to perfectionism. It may also be linked to parenting practices. We've got a lot of controlling, helicoptering, micromanaging parents who are pushing their kid toward their own definition of perfection and tend to love their kid in a performance contingent way where you're only as good as your last grade, your last goal, your last attainment. So it could very well be that parental control, parental criticism, parental overprotection are factors in this seeming rise in perfectionism as well.
Yeah, let me just stop you on those 2 points. So the whole social media, I mean, I don't think that's surprising because young people often talk about, oh, they feel so bad because all they see are perfect images of everybody, their peers, they're leading wonderful lives. What's wrong with me? Why can't I lead that life? And my life seems terrible compared to that. And because that's so pervasive, I could see how that would have quite a resounding effect on many, many young people. The parenting is really interesting because, are you seeing this commonality of a kind of parenting that could be a factor in contributing to perfectionism among young people?
Yeah, I'm going to speak to both your points because I think they're important. First, I'll cycle back to the social media point and reference a study we just put out at the start of 2022. Really interesting research, this time adolescents. And there were adolescents who were studied for 4 consecutive weeks in a row. And what we found with that group of adolescents is on weeks where they made social comparisons via social media, so they looked online, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, when they made these social comparisons online and they contacted social media, they felt poorly about their body. So their body image was low. They didn't like or appreciate their physical self. And their mood also tanked. So the more exposure perfectionistic people had to online images of a perfect sort, the more their mood crashed, the worse they felt about their bodies. And most of us would take that as like, duh, of course. But it's meaningful that that was the first study to quantify what a lot of us take as obvious. So it seems like when perfectionists get exposed to social media, it has a toxic effect on their mood and their body image. Back to the parenting point, we just put out another study, again, somewhere near the start of 2022, and it looks at parenting behaviors and how certain parenting behaviors seem to be driving the development of perfectionism. And the overall picture is one of a family environment that becomes an incubator for the development of perfectionism. And this involves a parent or parents who are critical and they're pressuring and they are setting lofty expectations and pushing their children to reach those expectations, really whether those kids like it or not. And that becomes then an incubator for the development of a child who's very perfectionistic, a hypercritical, demanding, pressurized familial environment. And I'm not saying those are nasty parents doing that. I think oftentimes they're exceedingly dedicated parents, very self-sacrificing. They're bringing them to dance lessons and football lessons and piano lessons, and they're already planning their child's CV in grade 3 so they can get into the best undergrad en route to becoming a brain surgeon. And those are enormously self-sacrificing parents who are making massive investments in their kids, but in doing so, probably rearing them to be self-critical perfectionists who self-destruct when they encounter failure.
Okay, so yeah, now what I find interesting about that is, I mean, there have always been parents like that, right? That's nothing new. There have always been parents who, high expectations, helicopter type parents, whatever. But the sense I get is that there's been an increase in that kind of parenting, that there are more parents like that. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why have so many parents embraced that kind of parenting? What's behind that?
Okay. Well, this is our chance to throw neoliberalism under the bus. That's one thought here, that there's a socio-cultural milieu of hyper-competitive individualism at work here, that you should stand on your own 2 feet, that you should be competitive before you're cooperative, that you should stand alone, and the best thing you can do is crush others in competition. And so that becomes a backdrop, really, since Thatcherism and Reaganism, for a sociocultural milieu in this era that is maybe conducive to changing parenting practices and to making a hyper-competitive society that's very concerned with individualistic outcomes, including perfection. And, there's been a corresponding rise in narcissism at the same time, and a drop in empathy. There are certain things that maybe suggest a hyper-competitive backdrop, and parents are responding to that.
Yeah. And do you think that with that so-called neoliberalism and this drive for productivity and competitiveness, et cetera, would it also go hand in hand with an increase in materialism and materialistic attitudes, and also a rise in sort of our celebrity culture and wanting that lifestyle, and that that lifestyle is perfect, the rich and famous? I'm wondering if all of this plays into it.
I think these parenting practices are shaped by that backdrop. Let's speak to productivity. We're sleeping less, we're working more. It's a time urgent world we live in. Email goes so fast, devices intrude into our life. There's no doubt that there's more pressure in this world. And if you step back over the last century, it's almost ridiculous how fast paced our world has become in comparison. And so I think that's part of that urgency, competitiveness, type A, hostility that goes along with it as well. As for celebrity culture, there's no doubt a tie there to perfectionism, because the celebrities churn out unrealistic images. And one way we can help people with all this mess is to help them become more critical consumers of the nonsense they come across. Usually a celebrity is a scaffold on which to hang beautiful clothes, and that can then be spray painted and photoshopped and photographed, and they look absolutely beautiful in some ways, but so toxic in others, because it propagates these completely unrealistic images. I'll also say, though, with a bit of humor, stroll through any well-established art gallery, and you'll see through different eras in history that people have been doing this. Formerly it was a lord with his wife and his maid and his 2 dogs and a couple of rabbits and abundance sitting on his table with some grapes and some wine. We've been prone to these embarrassing self-enhancements throughout history. I think a difference would be, though, we've now got teenagers spending 6 and 7 hours a day on average on social media alone, and that's different.
But that is so true. I had not thought about, historically, of course, like, why would a duke or anybody want to be painted in a negative light? Of course, they're going to be seen in a great light. That is that's a very good point. But you're right. It is much more pervasive today. Before we go on any further, what we've been talking a lot about is really external factors. What about, perfectionism, as far as like, is it something you can inherit? What's the genetic aspect to this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I've been at this for 15 years as a clinical psychologist and 2+ decades as a researcher. And sometimes in either venue, you talk to a parent and the parent's quite clear, and I believe them. Look, I did not pressure this kid. I did not criticize this kid. I did not tell them they had to work on their homework relentlessly in grade 4. So there are some humans who seem to be born into this world with a predisposition toward being perfectionistic. It seems to be part of their temperament and develops into their character and becomes their personality. I would say most often that's going to be the perfectionist we first started talking about, that
Mm.
self-directed perfectionist who has a ceaseless personal requirement to strive for perfection. And for some people, that's something they've internalized. So, for example, they were a ballet dancer, and after decades of coaching, staring in the mirror and endlessly being criticized to refine their technique, they internalized that and made it their own. But for other people, it does seem they're born with it. And consistent with that, maybe 30 to 50% of what we see in perfectionists seems to be attributable to behavior genetics. In other words,
Oh.
like many personality traits,
Hmm.
perfectionism is moderately to strongly heritable.
So if, let's say, there is this genetic component in someone they've inherited, um, what would it be? A higher propensity for perfectionism then, I guess, if it's heritable?
We're not exactly sure what they inherit, but
Okay.
yeah, it would be a predisposition to be self
Mm.
critical. What they're probably inheriting is something like conscientiousness, which is a very adaptive trait. It's good to be dutiful, organized, achievement oriented, reliable. It's good to be conscientious. But perfectionism is something like conscientiousness on steroids. It's an extreme maladaptive variant of conscientiousness. So there's no perfectionism gene. Heck, there's probably no conscientiousness gene, but they're probably inheriting a broad constellation of traits that would be quite adaptive. But for whatever reason, it becomes too extreme to them. And the other thing we're talking about here, there's no way to disentangle nature and nurture here.
Mm.
We have a sense that these traits are heritable, but almost immediately you're born into an environment that's starting to shape your perfectionism. And some people are born into a web of expectations. My kid's going to play in the NHL. My kid's going to be a brain surgeon. They're just born into
Yeah.
pressure and lofty and unrealistic expectations. And so you can imagine that genetic predisposition then gets an environment where they face pressure and criticism and demandingness, and it leads to the fullest possible expression of that genetic potential to be perfectionistic.
And Simon, you're a practicing psychologist, so you see patients who are trying to deal with perfectionism. Can you give us just maybe a couple of examples of how that manifests itself? Like, what kinds of situations do people get themselves into when they struggle with perfectionism?
When I was a resident finishing off my training at University of Washington, I was doing a placement in an inpatient psychiatric unit. And for months, I didn't see a single perfectionist. And I thought to myself, geez, Simon, what are you investing in terms of your career and research? I'm supposed to be studying mental illness, and I have not seen a perfectionist come across our facility to be cared for. And then it was exam time. I think it was December. It was exam time, traditional exam stress. And quite quickly, I saw 3 perfectionists, all in the wake of suicide attempts. So this tells us something about perfectionism and when they show up in clinical situations. There's nothing wrong with being a perfectionist as long as everything is perfect.
Mm.
And so these were high achieving perfectionistic students who were overburdened, overwhelmed by exams, had a result that they found was less than perfect, and thought they were so worthless they deserved to die.
But you know what you say, I mean, that really hits home. I mean, it's okay to be a perfectionist as long as everything is perfect, but then nothing is ever perfect. That's the irony though. Nothing ever
No,
is.
it isn't. And when you're a perfectionist, oftentimes your self-worth has an intimate tie to something like achievement. And so you're getting the grant, you're publishing the paper, you're getting the A plus, you're getting into medical school, okay. But at some point, adversity hits and we fail. And so for perfectionists, that failure feels unbearable. The gap between the perfect person they want to be and the less than perfect outcome they achieve makes them feel worthless. But perfectionism also manifests itself not uncommonly in the domain of the body: weight, shape, size, control, overeating. You could argue that for a subset of people with eating disorders, typically women with eating disorders, that's perfectionism playing itself out. in their bodies and with their dietary choices. And perfectionism can dominate a human's functioning when it comes to weight, shape, size, and eating. And so that's a very common problem. If you were to seek out individuals who have the highest levels of perfectionism observed in science to date, it would be women with anorexia nervosa.
The highest?
Massive levels of perfectionism compared to any other group out there. And those are individuals who are seemingly born perfectionists, and it plays out in various ways in their life, but they want to have perfect control over eating. They want to have perfect body image. They want to rigidly and perfectly control all aspects of what they eat and how they look. So perfectionism often attacks body and body image.
Can it extend to relationships? Oh, I didn't handle that well. Oh, why did I say that? Oh, does it extend to that as well? And then I don't know what the thought process would be of the perfectionist, right? If they walk away after, in their opinion, they didn't deal with something well.
In fact, not all, but a lot of the striving you'll see in perfectionists can link back to a quest for interpersonal resources. The perfectionist is going for respect, recognition, acceptance, to not disappoint other people. And perfectionism becomes a tool. Love me because I am perfect. Accept me because I am perfect. And sometimes it becomes a way to escape an environment that's dysfunctional, like an environment where a child or a spouse is abusive. So you try and solve that problem by being the perfect child, by being the perfect spouse. So relationships and interpersonal concerns very much drive perfectionists. They want your approval. They want your respect. They want your recognition. And one way they've learned to cope with that is, hey, I'll be perfect for you. I'll be the perfect spouse, boss, coworker, friend, so forth.
And does the person ruminate a lot? Do they go over and over and over the situation? Is that common to perfectionists?
Yes, it is. And it's common and it's destructive to perfectionists. It is a broody, ruminative type of personality. And that comes up with mistakes, for instance. I'm not talking about obvious, spectacular mistakes. They'll walk away from a conversation, replay it in their head. We'll call that post-event rumination over and over and over again. Should I have said this? Shouldn't I have said that? Why did he look this way? Why did she look that way? They dissect the conversation and brood and ruminate on really irrelevant microscopic aspects of it. And that's the fault-finding predilection of perfectionism, a nitpicking tendency. And it's often a cruel way to relate to yourself, where you replay everything and wonder why you weren't perfect. And the other thing is, what is the perfect conversation or interview? I don't know, and nor do perfectionists. But sadly, oftentimes they're willing to die for their sense of having fallen short of something no one's been able to define.
And you mentioned about women and anorexia, and then it made me wonder. So, is there any kind of what is the split in perfectionism among genders? Like, do we see any differences, among men, women?
Yeah, the definitive study on that has been yet to be done. But if I look at unpublished research, which is more or less my colleagues and I poking around to answer that question, there doesn't seem to be a large magnitude difference between men and women, despite some initial thoughts we had that it might be otherwise. I think there's still more to learn there. We've been studying it with a rather primitive binary where man, woman. I think it might be different according to gender roles. There's a need to take a more nuanced look at how perfectionism plays out and expresses itself across gender. For instance, and this is more theory than data, but it would seem to me that oftentimes women get caught up in a perfectionistic superwoman type of a role where you got to be killing it at work and killing it at home and across multiple domains. You need to be perfect. It's a very difficult form of perfectionism, which I don't see as often in men. But that's more nuanced than the fairly unsophisticated way we've looked at it so far.
Yeah.
Your modal male perfectionist is probably going to be way too wrapped up in his career and define his identity, his worth, his esteem entirely from his career.
Hmm. Yeah, so those questions are something you'd probably like to investigate further. Just going back to the women too. And the whole idea of being a superwoman and yeah, you got to kill it, in all areas of your life. Because um, we tend to think about women being more invested in relationships. Would that play a role in perfectionism with women, their relationships? More so than men, I mean.
I think so. And maybe more a tendency to want to please.
Mm.
I'm going to be perfect for you. I'm going to be the perfect spouse. I'm going to be the perfect coworker. In clinical practice, you see these amazing women who are incredible employees and completely burnt out because they want to work to please you and they'll go through a wall for you, but they push themselves beyond the point of exhaustion, trying to be perfect for coworkers or bosses or companies. And they're just exhausted because they're trying to be perfect for other people. And in some ways, that's a really admirable trait, but taken too far, it's absolutely exhausting.
Yeah, and see, now that makes me wonder as well. And again, I guess we're getting into sort of the external situation here. So, what happens if you yourself are not a perfectionist, not necessarily a perfectionist, but you're working with someone who is like maybe that person is your boss or your colleague, or maybe you're actually married to someone who's a perfectionist. What's that like? What do you do then?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that's challenging to disentangle empirically. We took a first and only shot at that a few years ago, and a very interesting set of results. We took an individual participant and we measured them on their perfectionism. And then we asked them to give us the contact information for 5 people around them who knew them well, who were significant in their life. And what we found is for those participants who said, geez, I get criticized, I face demands, I feel pressured to be perfect. In their 5 people of influence in their social sphere, they had people who were critical, who were demanding, who were pressuring them to be perfect. And so this is very interesting because I told you earlier, this is a personality trait. I said this is going on between the ears of an individual. And part of that is an assumption that there may be some distorted thinking going on. And so what we found is a mix. There probably is some distorted thinking going on, like a neurotic tendency to misread expectations, resulting in a pressure to be perfect. And this was the advance in science, the and is there are people in your environment who can be demanding, who do expect perfection, who do push for lofty and unrealistic goals. And when people report that, that's not a personality trait, that's just a reaction to their environment.
Oh, that's so interesting. I have to think, though, that let's say if you are married or you're with someone, in a serious relationship who is a perfectionist, that can't be easy. I mean, that's got to be really difficult. Do you see that in your practice?
Papers that support that idea that if your spouse is a perfectionist, you're subject to a lot of conflict, a lot of criticism, and really an unending sense that you're not good enough. You're not able to live up to their expectations. And it is our theory that perfectionism breeds a lot of interpersonal conflict, whether that's in romantic relationships or other sorts of relationships, up to the point where it's probably influencing the breakdown of marriages or other relationships. But perfectionists do seem prone to generating a lot of interpersonal conflict in their life. And some of that is the demandingness they direct toward other people.
So, I mean, it's such a complicated business. I mean, all these different factors that you've talked about, just to tease it all out. How do you approach this in your practice? Okay, so first of all, let me ask you, when you're seeing someone who is a perfectionist, how much success can you have with them in helping them deal with it? Like, I don't know how hardcore this trait is, that, you know what I mean? Is it inflexible or is there, some you can maneuver around it a little and have strategies and do things?
So we have a paper just winding its way through peer review right now that speaks to your question. And if you apply cognitive behavioral therapy, a widely used intervention, to the treatment of perfectionism, to date, the results are none too pretty. We have no convincing evidence that you can, through the application of cognitive behavioral therapy, meaningfully change perfectionism. Beyond that, we actually found some disturbing evidence that maybe 5 to 10% of people who undergo cognitive behavioral therapy who are perfectionistic actually get worse. So that's a call to action for researchers and clinicians alike to do better when it comes to the treatment of perfectionism. Now, over the last 3 decades, there's also some important things we've learned about treating perfectionism. First, let's not pretend we're going to change that trait quickly. And one challenge in helping perfectionists is they want it now, and they want to do it perfectly, and they want to do it in 10 sessions, when you might actually be looking at a course of therapy involving a year or quite likely years. And so what do we know? Perfectionists get in complicated, often hostile relationships with their psychologists, psychiatrists, or therapists. And that speaks to points we've already made in our conversation. We know that perfectionism creates intense and turbulent and conflictual social relationships. And what happens at home, what happens in the workplace, eventually shows up in the therapeutic setting. And one of your key predictors of outcome in therapy, whatever type of therapy it may be, is the nature and quality of the alliance you have with your client. You want a strong therapeutic alliance present, a sense of team, a sense of being aligned in goals, a sense of unity, a sense of being understood, validated, a presence of empathy and positive regard. You need that alliance present. So you have to understand, as the treating psychologist, that perfectionism attacks that therapeutic alliance. And perfectionism itself attacks expectations about outcome and urgency and resolving these problems. So a lot of what you need to do in therapy with a perfectionist is not rush into changing their thoughts or behaviors, but first make sure you have in place a good relationship, a trusting, collaborative bond. And then from that, much is possible. And without that, expect premature termination and no success.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting that, the condition itself has such a major impact on the relationship between the practitioner and the person, right? And the treatment. Yeah, because
Yes.
so it affects the treatment, because so you're saying that if you have a really good relationship with your therapist, then you've just, I guess, increased the possibility that you can be helped.
Absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to realize that perfectionism is treatment interfering. It's going to be attacking that therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you have to be in it for the long haul.
Yes, changing adult personality, that's not an easy thing to do.
In any way, probably. Not just perfectionism.
The shape of my head and the size of my feet are fairly fixed. I'm not going to say personality is quite as cast in stone as those attributes, but it's close.
Yeah, and then what about people who, they can't afford to see a therapist, or they don't want to, or they for whatever reason they don't. What can they do? Like, what can they do on their own?
Well, the standard line would be you should go and buy a self-help book. There are several out there, and read it. Our recent review of the literature suggests that's a kind of poor recommendation. I'm going to say that would be cruelly optimistic to just say, why don't you take this on by yourself and figure it out? Maybe if you had very mild levels of perfectionism, that might be indicated. But by the time you have clinically meaningful levels of perfectionism that have taken a stranglehold on your personality and relationships, you need some therapy of a longer duration. And so I think we actually are doing a disservice to a subset of the population to say, hey, why don't you read this book, when we need longer term therapy. And that's part of what we need to offer people within our healthcare system. There's a subset of people who have challenges with their personality, and they require a longer term course of therapy that's more intensive. And it's quite clear from an economic standpoint that if you make that sort of investment in that individual, you can expect a good return on that investment in terms of having a more productive human who has harmonious relationships and makes a greater contribution to your society and utilizes fewer resources through other shorter term contacts within the healthcare system. So we need to start to think about what would universal mental health care look like for Canadians and what sort of investments should we be making. Other countries, Britain and Australia being examples, have already made those investments.
Yeah. So, for you, what it would be, I don't know, is there some sort of big looming question of research around perfectionism that you really want to see answered? What's the next big question?
I think we need to make critical and much needed advances in the treatment of perfectionism and perfectionists. We said earlier in our conversation that perfectionism is on the rise. It's very much a problem of our times. So we need interventions that work. And perfectionism has a very strong link to depression, anxiety, bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa, binge eating, panic, OCD, alcoholism, disordered personality, suicide. It's a risky trait to have. And sometimes if you treat that perfectionist, you can spare them the ravages of all those forms of mental illness I just mentioned. So there's a real impetus for us to do better when it comes to helping and treating perfectionists. And we need innovation because we've just summarized the last 2 or 3 decades of research on treating perfectionism, and it's none too impressive. And so maybe some of that innovation would be a couples therapy instead of focusing just on an individual. Or what would it be like to treat a family instead of just focusing on an individual? Or how interesting would it be to carry out an intervention at the level of a subculture or an organization to help a dance school or a medical school be less critical, demanding, micromanaging, and pressuring for people? So we definitely need more treatment and more innovation. I think we also have to talk to parents about those parenting practices that are likely leading to the development of unhelpful forms of perfectionism. Because it's those parenting practices that are in part, not entirely, but in part, encouraging the rise of perfectionism. We definitely also need to make more critical and savvy consumers of social media images. If you're engaging with your phone 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day, you can't be uncritical in your consumption of these images because they become internalized and they become toxic in how the individual relates to him or herself.
That was a fascinating conversation, Simon. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of research with us, both yours and others, and just shedding a lot of light on the whole topic of perfectionism. Thanks very much.
I also enjoyed our conversation, Mary. Thank you. And I really like what you're doing with CRAM.
Oh, thank you. That's Simon Cherry. He's a psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University. He's an internationally recognized expert on perfectionism. For more on his research and his practice, please check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram Podcast. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.